Welcome back to Music 101. We're going to be looking at Chapter 3 today, Martin Luther and the Bach cantatas. So, we can't talk about cantatas or chorales without talking about our boy Martin Luther. Martin Luther, as you remember, was the leading figure in the Protestant Reformation and has many lasting contributions to Western culture. Martin Luther believed in congregational singing and would sometimes employ professional singers and instrumentalists to create a polyphony in church services. So chorales were German hymn tunes. They were composed or recycled melodies using German poetry or biblical passages. The specific chorale that was chosen for the week were integrated into the weekly service, and they were sung in unison by the congregation, sometimes with a professional choir with four-part harmony. So this is a picture of one of, let's go back and make sure I didn't skip something, of the church that actually Johann Sebastian Bach went to, which we're going to talk about Bach in just a little bit. So with the Lutheran cantata, it is a multi-movement work for soloist, chorus, and orchestra. It has solo arias, recitatives, and choruses, and it's a musical sermon with elaboration of a weekly hymn based on a gospel reading of the day and an integral part of the church service. So basically, a cantata was a religious form of music, and the way I like to describe it is if your church today was to do a cantata, they would take the entire service and sing. There isn't any action or anything like that, and it would go with some sort of religious theme, and the text would be from some biblical passage. So Johann Sebastian Bach was well known for these, and he was a culminating figure of Baroque style. So Johann Sebastian Bach is probably one of the most important composers in music history because everyone looks to him for composing techniques, for how to write a good piece. Like, everything goes back to Bach. He was a German composer and an organ virtuoso, as well as a devout Lutheran. And he was renowned during his lifetime as a performer. And as you're going to see through music history, the further we get into the contemporary music, the more composers and musicians will be respected and well known in their lifetime. Here's a picture of Johann Sebastian Bach. He had two court positions. So remember, back then there were two places that you could write music, in the court or at the church. So he had two court positions, as well as working at St. Thomas's Church and a college. He also had two marriages with 19 children, and that's what I tell my students in my middle school how they remember Johann Sebastian Bach, is that he had 19 children, 4 sons that became leading composers. His style raised the existing forms to the highest level, and he had unequaled mastery of contrapuntal compositions. And we're going to talk about contrapuntal in the fugue chapter, so if that just kind of freaks you out, wait until chapter 28, when we talk about the fugue. His output was prolific in the secular, sacred, suites, concertos, sonatas, keyboard music, and cantatas, and he's well known for the St. John and St. Matthew Passions, which are these big choral works based on the book of John and Matthew, the Well-Tempered Clavier, the Art of Fugue, which we're going to talk about in chapter 28, and the Brandenburg Concertos, which we're going to talk about later on as well. 200 of the Bach cantatas survive, and Bach composed 4 of 5 yearly cycles. Each cantata had 5 to 8 movements. The first, middle, and last movement were based on a chorale tune and a full ensemble. They were hymn-like settings to intricate fugues, and interspersed were solos and duet arias with recitatives. Now, when we go on to the next chapter and we're talking about oratorios, there might be some confusion about the difference between the two because they sound really similar. The difference between the two would be the format. So, cantata, first, middle, and last movements were based on a chorale. So that's the big difference between a cantata and an oratorio, is that a cantata was based on a German chorale that was already composed or is composed by another person. So we're going to look at Sleeper's Wake, which is one of Bach's famous cantatas, in 7 movements. The text comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. And if you're unfamiliar with the story in the Gospel of Matthew, basically it's a parable told by Jesus about the second coming of Christ. And there are 5 foolish virgins and 5 wise virgins. And the 5 foolish virgins had their lamps but didn't have extra oil or their lamps trimmed. And the wise virgins had extra oil. So when they both sets of virgins fall asleep, and then the announcement comes in that the bridegroom is coming, because back in Bible times they would the wedding party would wait outside while the marriage would take place or whatever. So the bridegroom is coming. The foolish virgins had to go and buy oil, and by the time they buy oil and come back, then the bridegroom has already gone into the feast and they're locked outside. And it's just a parable of being watchful and being ready for the second coming of Christ. And here is an artistic depiction of that scene. So we have the virgins here, we have the foolish virgins, and then the wise virgins, because they were ready for Christ's return. This cantata is based on a hymn tune composed by Philip Nicolai in 1599. And the same hymn is sung later in the service by the congregation. The chorale tune featured is in 3 chorale movements. So we have the chorale fantasia, which is kind of like an opening overture type thing. I'll let you kind of listen to that on your own. But it has bar forms. We have 2 A sections, a repeated A section, and then a B section. And it's majestic and march-like because it's the arrival of Christ, because Christ is a king. So march-like. An uplifting major key because it's a happy event with the return of Christ if you know him and all of that. Insistent dotted rhythms in the orchestra, and recurring instrumental sections or ritornellos. So we're going to talk more about ritornellos when we talk about concertos, but they are just these, the main theme would be stated, and then stuff would happen, and then you would come back to this main theme, and then stuff would happen. It's more evident in later chapters when we talk about ritornellos. Ritornellos. These are very complex with imitative polyphony in the lower voices. So the chorale, and this is the one that we're going to listen to because it's the one that's the most famous, is a unison chorale, bar form AAB with a bright major key, and the chorale tune is sung in unison by tenors with a counter melody in the strings. And the counter melody in the strings is what everyone knows, if that makes sense. Number 7, chorale, is stanza 3 of the chorale with bar form AAB. The chorale melody is in the soprano line and the fanfare-like opening with homorhythmic textures. Remember, homorhythmic texture is when everything lines up. And all of this is in your book on page 134 and 135, so it kind of gives you a breakdown of what's going on. So basically what's happening is you have the first stanza is played one way, or I believe, yes. First stanza is played one way, second stanza is played another way, third stanza, blah, blah, blah. So it'd be like singing a hymn at church, but then each time you sing that there's something different going on. So this is the chorale tune that it's based off of. And these are the little ritornellos that are going on. So the one that we're going to look at is the unison chorale. Oh, that's right. I restarted my computer and didn't pull up my resources again. So the biggest difference between a cantata, just one more time to reiterate here, the difference between the two is the fact that the cantatas are the cantatas are based off of a chorale. So that's the difference there. Well, and remember, you have access to this if you have a code for your digital access. That way you can have access to all of these. Clips that we are looking into and listening to. So we're going to be listening to the Unison Chorale because it is the most famous of this cantata.
Sleepers Awake, Cantata number 140 by J.S. Bach. Bach borrowed an existing melody, a tune written by another composer, and used it as the melody of the tenors. This tune is a chorale, a congregational hymn of the Lutheran Church. You can hear it very clearly because the tenors sing at a much slower rate than the strings play.
So the ritornellos are that like dun da dum be dum da dum dee dum ba dum dee ba dum be dum.
There are three distinct layers of music in this movement. While the tenors sing a slow-moving melody, the bass line plays its own music at a slightly faster pace, and the strings play an even faster counter melody, a secondary melody played at the same time as the primary melody.
So that's the counter melody that's going on, and those little sections of when they're playing are called ritornellos. So here's the form.
Bach not only borrowed the pitches of the chorale melody that someone else composed, he used its bar form as...
Well, here we go. Internet. There we go. Well,
Bach not only borrowed the pitches of the chorale melody that someone else composed, he used its bar form as the form for this movement. Bar form is AAB form. The first section of music repeats, and then is followed by contrasting music. The first A section sounds like this. Here's the second A section.
Notice how it's going to sound the same.
The B section sounds like this.
So the tenors are singing a different section.
So remember to listen for the slow-moving chorale melody in the tenors against the faster-moving counter melody in the strings and bar form, AAB.
So there you go. That's basically what you need to know about cantata. It's just it's a big work based on some religious text, and it's based on a German chorale. That's the big difference between the Ontario. I'm sorry, I'm really tired. Can't think about my brain right now, but which we'll talk about in a later lecture. So that's all we have. If you want some actual looking at the text of what is being said, you can find that on page 135. And we'll be looking at chapter 24.